Thank you for joining us, President Robinson.
It's a pleasure, Mayesha. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well. To begin, can you help our audience understand what do you mean by climate justice? And how have you seen climate change exacerbate injustice?
I'm always happy to talk about climate justice because that's the way I came to understand the climate issue, working in African countries and seeing that they were disproportionately and much earlier affected than my country, Ireland. When I was president of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, I never made a speech about climate. I spoke about the environment, but climate wasn't real. It wasn't affecting us. But I saw it in 2003, 2004, 2005, working on the rights that matter if you don't have them in African countries, rights to food, water, health, education. It was so clear they were devastated already at that time, and they were not responsible. And also, you know, it was the black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world who were the most affected. So it was also a racial injustice. It wasn't a guilt thing in the sense that nobody individually wanted to do this. It had grown out of the way in which we built our economies on fossil fuel in the industrialized world and the effect that had, the scientific effect. And then, you know, that was the first injustice. The second was the gender injustice within that, the different social roles of women, the different access to power, sometimes the different access to rights like land rights, access to credit or everything. And then women have to put food on the table, have to make their communities resilient. The third injustice, thankfully, children and young people around the world are calling us out on, the intergenerational injustice. I can't make a decision now, you can, you're not doing it, and I'm not going to have a future. You know, think of that for young people, that sense of stark injustice that's causing a lot of mental health problems. And the fourth injustice is more subtle. It's the injustice of the different pathways to development. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. We should be grateful to the workers of coal, oil, gas, and in my country, peat, turf, because they helped us build our economies. But now we must move with just transition out of those very things that are destroying us. And just transition costs money. And I'm glad to say the EU and others are now realizing the need for big funds and big plans for communities and workers, that they're not left behind. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself. And it's not part of your question, but if I may, Mayesha, I'd like to tell the story of how successful the climate justice movement was at Paris. It's underestimated. I mean, people often talk about the fact that we got the success of the Paris Agreement because at the time, President Obama of the US and President Xi of China agreed there would be a Paris Agreement. That seemed to be the power play. It actually wasn't the important one. The important one was the goal of Paris. And what happened was the small island states under the leadership of Tony de Broom of the Marshall Islands, the indigenous peoples, the civil society, we marched in the street in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. And what was formed at the very beginning of the actual Paris Agreement itself was a high-level coalition with one objective, to get 1.5 degrees into the goal of Paris, scientifically, that was necessary. And that was led by Tony de Broom, but the US joined, the EU joined, other countries joined, and that was the new goal, to stay well below 2 degrees and work for 1.5 degrees. But the scientists had never studied the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists. And that was the report in October 2018 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a special report on 1.5 degrees of warming. And it said quite clearly, I'm simplifying, but this is what they said, there is a big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, because probably in that time, the coral reefs will disappear, the permafrost will melt terribly, the Arctic ice will probably disappear. There are all kinds of tipping point issues that they're worried about. And therefore, the strong, unified recommendation of the scientists was the whole world actually needs to stay at 1.5 degrees. And to do that, we need to reduce by 45% our carbon emissions. The most recent report of the IPCC said 43% reduction by 2030. It's still a huge reduction. And, you know, it's really interesting that it was the most disadvantaged, but the most knowledgeable, who insisted on a real science goal. And in the COP26, which I was very active in, we were all aligning with 1.5. That's become the language. And we wouldn't have had that without the pressure of the climate justice movement. And I'm very proud of that. And of course, to answer in part, it's obvious that everything is exacerbating now. COVID exacerbated the climate issue. And now the Ukraine war, this terrible war, is driving up food and fuel prices, driving people into poverty. So there's been a succession of, senses of people just trying to just cope with shocks after shocks after shocks. And it's getting slightly worse at the moment, which is worrying.
Thanks so much, Mary. And there's the overview you provided. There's really so many elements to this. Let me pick up on one piece, which is that, as you acknowledged, there's been some important policy advancements at international and national levels. But achieving consensus on global climate governance remains a real challenge. And so I wanted to ask you, what actions would you like to see going forward from key players such as the United States to foster a more just transition to net zero?
I'd very much like to see the United States fulfill a lot of the climate kind of pledges that were made actually in COP26 by John Kerry. There was a real sense of the United States being back, but the truth is, we're seeing the problems politically in the United States, and we need to see the tax incentives to decarbonize industry, for example, transport and power, the 500 billion climate pact of the stalled Build Back Better. The Build Back Better is not going to come in full, but bits of it can come back. And that's a really important part. And, China has said, and, there's some truth in it, that the United States overpromises and doesn't deliver. And that's a real worry now. And it's a real worry even politically about who will be the next president and so on. So that's one thing. But I'm pleased to see that, so much of industry now, so much of investment is aligning with 1.5. There's a lot happening that's important. The trouble is, as I discovered when I was asked the question in Paris on live television, the result of Climate Action Tracker measuring the pledges to date that were made before and at COP26 in Glasgow. Where are we in looking at where the world is going? And it was quite clear from their report. They said, unfortunately, we're still heading for, if everybody fulfilled all the pledges, which is again saying something, that we would be heading for a 2.4 degree world and at the end of this century. And that caused me to actually get quite emotional. I lost it for a few minutes because for me, it meant, so many people alive today and all our children and grandchildren will face an unlivable world. And, that can't be possible. But that is where we are, even with the pledges. So for COP26, and we'll come back to that probably, we have to get real about where we are.
Thank you. And, really putting into real terms what it means, which is not just livelihoods, but lives on the line. Yeah. And when we look ahead, you talked about Paris, you talked about Glasgow, and of course we have the African COP coming up. And I wanted to ask you, in what ways should the agenda of the upcoming COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt prioritize climate justice? What would you like to see happen there and come out of that series of negotiations?
I'd like to see full implementation of what was agreed in Glasgow. It still isn't enough, but it was pretty smart. First of all, we agreed that instead of waiting for 5 years or whatever, we would that the biggest emitters would come back with more ambition to Egypt this year. That's important, and that has to happen. And that is most of the G20 countries. That is the Australias, that's the United States, but it's also the Chinas, the Indias, the Russias for that matter, the Saudi Arabias, all of them, Australia, I think I mentioned, all of them have to come back with more ambition, or we won't be having that kind of safe world. Secondly, there was a commitment to double climate adaptation finance. Now, that's really important because an awful lot of the climate finance goes to reducing emissions, which we know is very serious and very important, but not enough is going to helping communities to become resilient. The shocks are horrible now. I mean, the IPCC report recently said about 3.3 billion people in the world today are highly vulnerable from climate. And in many cases, it has passed the question of adaptation. So we have to get serious about doubling climate finance for adaptation by 2025, which was committed in Glasgow, and also being able to have, the kind of real sense that we're in a world where if we don't step up now, we're not going to have any kind of livable future. It will happen earliest, of course, in the poorest parts of the world, but it will affect all the world. The shocks have hit the northern hemisphere now, as we know. So, that's really important.
Thank you, Marianne. You've really issued a clarion call. And, over the course of our conversation, you've touched on the grave warnings from scientists about accelerating climate change. And of course, the continued many challenges to achieving net zero. But to finish off our conversation, I'm wondering what gives you cause for optimism and who makes you feel hopeful about the future?
Young people. I'm extraordinarily impressed, and the elders that I'm chair of, we have a lot of intergenerational conversation, and we learn from young people. We have blogs on our website, theelders.org, which are very thoughtful, very knowledgeable from young climate activists, and that gives me great hope. And what I want more and more is that all of us try to imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards. I mean, we're told we have to have a world that has bent that curve to be on course for 1.5 by 2030. We have to reduce now by 43% our emissions. That's technical language. Nobody's moved by that. What we need to do is imagine it will be a much healthier world. It will be a world where cities will be much greener. There'll probably be farms in cities, vertical farms producing food. The countryside will be regenerated, more wilding. We're seeing it in the bogs in Ireland now. We don't want to use turf anymore, so we're rewilding the bog to sink the carbon. We need to recover the terrible damage that's been done to the rainforests. I mean, just as we speak, it's worse and worse. It's madness. We need to and somehow, I feel that women are going to have to step up in particular. Women give me great hope. Women's leadership meetings that I'm involved in, because there's such trust among us. There's a trust that we know what we're talking about, and we know how much concerned we are, and we know we have to change and do it now and change behavior, consume less. And we can be very happy consuming less. We have a throwaway, wasteful society. When I grew up, we learned to darn, we learned to sew, and my brothers, I had 4 brothers, learned to reuse clothes, hand-me-down clothes. We need to get back to that sense of materials being, a circular economy. And what we need to really understand is it will be a much happier world. We genuinely will feel better about it. And that's what I hope we can work towards.
Thank you. This point about the circular economy, reducing wastage, but also prolonging the life of our material goods, whatever they are, I know has been an undercurrent of our conversation over the course of these 2 days and even this morning. So thank you for providing that reminder to all of us. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, President Robinson, for sharing your perspectives and your continued leadership.